very big round of applause for Dr. Bjørn Lomborg.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. And thank you very much, Hannah, for pitching my new book, which I'm not going to talk about at all. Now, that's not entirely true. I'll probably talk about it if you ask some questions. But what I want to talk about, really, is to think about how we deal with this energy transition that we're trying to do. Hannah was talking about how we want a lot of good stories. I'm actually going to challenge that a little bit because I'm very much of a data guy. I used to teach statistics to a lot of freshman people, and everybody, as you might imagine, hated it. But it's really a good way to understand the world. And I tend to think that graphs are sexy, so I'm going to show you a lot of them. But fundamentally, I want to tell you a story that I think we don't hear, but we should, if we're actually going to succeed in doing an energy transition. So look, global warming, absolutely, it's real, it's man-made. That's not the point that I'm trying to make here, but it's often vastly exaggerated. And that leads to really bad judgments. Because if you think this is the end of the world, you're willing to do everything to tackle global warming. And a lot of people do now. So a recent OECD survey actually showed that 60% of everyone in the rich countries now believe that global warming will likely or very likely lead to the end of mankind unless we do something about it. That's just simply ridiculous. I mean, apart from being an incredible stress on most people, that's not what the UN Climate Panel tells us at all. But it is what we typically hear. So I'm just going to show you a very, very few select sort of snippets, but you hear this all the time, right? Guterres, our UN Secretary General, he tells us, the world is facing a grave climate emergency. Every week brings new climate-related devastation, floods, droughts, heat waves, wildfires, superstorms. We're in a battle for our lives, and climate change is the biggest threat to the global economy. This is sort of the standard conversation around climate change, and I'm going to argue not only is it untrue, or mostly untrue, but it's also very, very bad for us to actually find the smart ways that we are going to fix this real problem. So, fundamentally, I would love to walk through all of it, but I just have 35 minutes, and I want to make sure that we have lots of time afterwards for a Q&A. So I'm going to just go very quickly through a few of these things, and then what I want to do is to basically tell you how we should think about doing this smarter. But, please feel free if you have any of the other questions on some of the other things. I'm just going to show you hurricanes, right? Because hurricanes are such great stories. And this is one of the points that Hannah just mentioned. This is how we sell stories in the world. We don't sell stories with statistics. We sell them with stories. And hurricanes tell great, great stories. That's why this is such a fun picture to show, right? It's devastation. It's a lot of people, their lives destroyed, possibly even drowned and dead. But clearly, this has a huge impact. But is it actually true that we're seeing more and more hurricanes? No. If we look, and again, we have very poor data across the whole world, but we do actually have good data for the US since 1900 on landfalling hurricanes. Remember, we don't know how many hurricanes are out in the open ocean. We now know because we have satellites, but we didn't know before. So it looks like we have more and more because we get better and better at discovering them. So, for instance, named storms, so 2 years ago, researchers estimated we saw 9 more named hurricanes than we would have in 2000. So not very long ago, just simply because of better technology. But if there was a landfalling hurricane, so one that actually came on shore, it seems unlikely that nobody would have noticed it, at least since 1900, because the whole Atlantic and Caribbean seaboard was populated by then. And if you look at that statistic, have we seen more and more hurricanes? No. Actually, the data show we've seen slightly fewer. Now, a lot of people would argue, but global warming will probably lead to stronger hurricanes. That's actually true. So global warming will probably mean we'll see fewer hurricanes, but stronger hurricanes. Fewer is better, stronger is worse. It turns out that overall, stronger outcompetes fewer, so overall we'll probably see more damage. That's why global warming is a real problem. But do we actually see that now? No. And that's also why we struggle to actually even show the fingerprint of this. If we look at the hurricanes for major hurricanes, so Category 3 and above, again, we see the same decline. We also see this when we try to recalibrate it. It's very hard to get good data for the whole world. Probably we have it from 1955. It shows sort of the same progress, but we don't feel nearly as certain about this. But the reason why I'm showing you this is because the data doesn't confirm this, it's the end of the world. And I'm going to show you a lot more data on that. But part of this is because we're just richer and much more resilient. But this fundamentally undermines the conversation about this is the end of the world. And I think it's important to undermine that, because the end of the world means this is the only thing we focus on. If global warming is a meteor hurtling towards Earth, nothing else we do matters, right? That's the conversation that we have in much of the rich world. The only thing that matters is that meteor that's hurtling towards Earth. We just got to pull everything else aside and just focus on climate change. That makes sense if it is a meteor hurtling towards Earth, but it's not. And I'll show you a lot of other graphs, and I'll show you some of the economic evidence that indicate that this is not the case. It's a problem, not the end of the world. And if it's a problem, then we can start realizing, oh, wait, there's a lot of other problems in the world. Climate change is one of them, but it's only one of them, and we need to fix all of them in the 21st century. And the rich world's sort of excessive focus on this one issue means that we end up ignoring a lot of other things that are very, very simple and very cheap to do, and where we could do a lot more good at much lower cost first. And so that was actually what my new book is about. So I did actually slip a little bit of it in. But what I want to talk about is why are we then getting it so wrong on climate change? Why do we think this is the end of the world? I would argue it's to a very large extent because we miss that people adapt. So, just take a look at how many people die from climate-related deaths. We have pretty good data over the last 100 years. Again, we have probably worse data back in time, but it seems very unlikely that we would have missed really big stuff, right? So if we just look at climate-related deaths, that's floods, droughts, storms, wildfires, and extreme temperatures. We have good data from the International Disaster Database. And if you look at how many people died, so obviously this is a wildly varying number, so I'm going to average over decades to give some sense of proportion. Back in the 1920s, so 100 years ago, how many people died from climate-related disasters like these? Turns out it was almost 500,000 people. So 500,000 people died each and every year. Now, most people would, certainly if you look at the news media, certainly if you think about how most young people experience this through their televisions, what would you expect? You'd expect this to be going up. Now, I admittedly, I already sort of gave it away because there's no space to go up, right? But what it actually does is it surprisingly drops dramatically. Last full decade, was that 18,000 people died each and every year in the 2010s. We've seen a reduction of about 96%. Last 3 years, and again, that's not really any numbers, it's not enough, but they were actually even lower. So last year was 11,000 people. So all the stuff you hear on the news translates into these 11,000 people. Now, mind you, you don't hear about most of these. Many of these are floods in India and flash floods in Afghanistan and other places you never hear about. You do hear about, for instance, the heat dome. Do you remember 2 years ago in the US and Canada? You hear a lot about that. You hear about the floods in Germany. So there's a few of these that we actually hear. But the whole point here is we're not well served if we just hear about a small fraction of it and believe this is what is basically eating up the planet. We think the planet is dying more and more, but actually what we see is a decline of somewhere between 96 and 98% over the last 100 years. This has nothing to do, or very little to do with climate. It has everything to do with the fact that as people get richer, they get more resilient, they get better at tackling these issues. But of course, what that tells you is also who are the most vulnerable people in the world? Those are typically very poor people, very marginalized people, people who live in Tacloban in the Philippines and many other places. The real issue here is if we want to help them, how do we help them best? One way, of course, and that's the standard argument, is we need to help them by cutting our carbon emissions now so that they will have less, they will still have more problem because global warming will keep on going, but they'll have slightly less more of a problem by the end of the century. Well, we could also focus on, I don't know, get them out of poverty. If we did that, they would be much, much more resilient. They would be just like this, right? I mean, remember, if a hurricane hits Florida, sure, a couple of people die and a lot of damage, but that's about it. If the same hurricane hits Guatemala, tens of thousands of people die. Their economy is devastated. It's fundamentally a question of being not rich or being resilient, right? And that's the conversation that we need to have. Again, if you look at flooding, so very clearly, one of the big problems of climate change is that sea levels, just like everything else, is when the sea warms, it'll expand, and so we'll get higher sea levels. We'll also have some runoff from Antarctic and Greenland. But fundamentally, what happens to human beings? Well, if you look at these again, I'm just going to show you a modeling exercise. How many people are flooded? This is a very, very weak argument, right? So this is really model generated. This is one of the most quoted papers, and it has one of the big advantages that it runs pretty much all of the both physical and economic models to this. They find that on average, using all these models, about 3.4 million people are flooded each year today. That has a cost of about $11 billion. These are in 2015 dollars, I believe. They're all inflation adjusted. $13 billion in dike cost. The total cost is 0.05% of GDP. So this is not nothing, but it's certainly not a huge issue, but it is an issue, and obviously it's a terrible issue for these 3.4 million people who are flooded. I'm just going to show you the worst case warming with the highest population, the highest GDP, so the most stuff to be damaged, right? But they all show the same sort of pattern. What happens if you have about 1 meter of sea level rise? Well, if there's no adaptation, you actually see this. With no adaptation, you end up with 187 million people flooded. This was the headline in New York Times and Washington Post and pretty much any newspaper that you could possibly imagine. The original data is back from 2011. It was last year, I believe. It was all, again, in both New York Times and Washington Post. These numbers keep coming up. They're very, very well credited. What they basically say is, if you look at where everybody lives and you calculate what happens when the sea level rises about 1 meter, there's 187 million people within that area. So they are going to get flooded. They will have to move. That's absolutely true if nobody does anything. But remember, of course, it's very, very unlikely that we're going to be standing here for the next 80 years and watch the sea level, oh my God, now it's up to my hip. Now I can't breathe anymore. We don't act like that, right? We're not actually doing that. We never do that. What actually happens, of course, is we adapt. And I'm glad to say you guys are the country that I always use an example, right? Because you know that you can do that. I don't know if you know, but Schiphol Airport actually is probably the only airport in the world that has on its website that they used to be, they're probably the only airport in the world that used to be a site for a major naval battle. But you don't kind of imagine that when you're in Schiphol, right? I mean, you guys have actually shown that you can do this. So what happens is this cost an enormous amount of money if we didn't do any adaptation. It would cost $55 trillion. David Wallace Wells, the uninhabitable Earth, quoted the high end of that, $110 trillion. This would be not the end of the world, but it would be hugely costly, about 5% of global GDP. This would obviously be a catastrophe. But it's also important to say, this will never happen. All of the studies show that, of course, rich people will not let this happen. And even richer people, as we expect the world to be over the next 80 years, will even more not let this happen. What will actually happen? The researchers also did that. And just notice, you probably almost can't see it. We'll see virtually nobody die and nobody getting flooded from a 1 meter sea level rise. With adaptation, we expect about 15,000 people to get flooded each and every year. It'll have higher costs yet, but that's because we'll be much richer, so there's much more to flood. And we'll also have much higher dike cost. These are all annual costs. But the total cost will be much, much lower. It'll almost be 10 times lower. My point here is this graph shows you what's wrong with the current conversation. If you think this is the answer to, this is what's going to happen with climate change, and this is pretty much what all media will tell you, because it's a much more fun story. We're all going to drown. That's a much more fun story, but it's just not true. Because in any realistic sense, we're all going to survive. We're actually going to have very, very few people flood it. Now, had we done climate policy as well, instead of having 15,000 people flood it each and every year, we would only have 10,000 people flood it. So that's better. Climate change is absolutely an issue, but the vast amount of issue, of course, here is adaptation. And we will do a lot of that. The real question is, how smart are we going to be about it? How effective are we going to be about it? And so again, we need to have a smarter and a more nuanced conversation about climate change if we're actually going to get to this. So my main point here is simply to say, we think this is the end of the world, and that makes us do a lot of stupid stuff. But actually, this is not the end of the world. It is a problem. And that means we start needing to say, how should we fix it? So the current set of solutions don't fix it. I've just put together, and again, given that I don't have all that much time, I would love to have your questions afterwards. But fundamentally, we have a lot of people in rich countries that are trying to go renewable. That's basically what the transition is being sold. We're going to go net zero. We're going to go net zero by 2050, or maybe even 40 or 30, or whatever the number is. But the reality is, it's not happening. So if you look at the global share of renewable energy over the last couple of hundred years, we have good data from 1800. In 1800, almost all of the world's energy, except for the UK, which was already started its industrial revolution, was from renewables. So we were incredibly renewable. We were probably about 94%. Since then, we've tried to get rid of renewables, right? For the last 200 years, we've tried to get rid of renewables. And what we see here is, since 1970 or thereabouts, we had a pretty permanent here at around 13, 14%. This is almost entirely poor countries using bad fuel like wood, dung, cardboard, whatever they could get their hands on to keep warm and cook. That's basically where most of those 13% came from. The whole energy transition, all of the stuff that everyone talks about on TV and everything else, is this little uptick. This is what we have managed to do with an enormous amount of trillions of dollars. This is not nothing. We're now at about 16% of renewable energy. That's something, but it's not very much. I would like you to just, notice how impossible it's going to be to get to 100% in 2050. We're not. We're just not. And everybody knows that, but a lot of people don't really want to say it, right? If you actually look, and again, I'm going to share with you the latest estimate from the International Energy Agency, from their 2022 estimate, what will happen if everyone does everything that they have promised to do in all of their political realms? Remember, this is vastly unrealistic, but if we assume that, then we will get to just over 30% by 2050. We're not anywhere near. And just notice, and again, I'm not going to claim that this has any linearity to it, but it's certainly not exponentially going this way. If anything, and you know this very, very well, these are the easy percents to deal with. As we get higher and higher up, it's going to get harder, not easier. And so if you assume that this is linear, which I think is pretty generous, how long will it take us to get to 100%? Well, we'll get there by the end of next century, right? We are not anywhere close to delivering on the stuff that we promise. We think we are because we talk ourselves into a frenzy, because we say this is the end of the world, we got to do something. We think we're willing to spend an enormous amount of money on it, but we're not really, and we're not getting very far. To a very large extent, that's because this is only a conversation that's happening in the rich world. We have this conversation in Holland, we have it in Europe, we have it in the US, we have it in the rest of the OECD, we have it a little bit in the elites in India and China, but not really India and China, and certainly not Africa. We don't have most of the emissions on board because fundamentally we have shown that fossil fuel makes you rich. Renewable energy mostly is costly. That's why I think we really need to recognize that we're not going to solve this anytime soon. One of the things I put together last year, and I think this surprised a lot of people, because we think that we're somehow going to be able to survive this because we have, for instance, a lot of batteries. I just want to show you this one thing. We're trying to do everything right without the appropriate technology. So people have this idea that batteries somehow will come in and save us. But let's just realize right now we have battery power enough to back up the entire and only the electricity consumption of the world for about 1 minute and 15 seconds. By the end of this decade, because we'll dramatically increase our use of batteries, or our implementation of batteries, we'll possibly get to a point where we'll have about 11 minutes of battery power. We are not going to be able to power the world, and you know very well, if we actually want to have just electricity 24/7, we will need this for weeks on end. We need a whole different kind of storage system. Obviously, this works well. I live in Sweden. I come from Denmark. We're fine with lots of hydropower, but if you don't have that, you don't really have a good solution just with renewables, and certainly not just with solar and wind as the only thing. And again, we need to be honest about what's the cost of this. So there's fairly few, there's a lot of sort of hand-waving estimates out there. There are very few that are really good, and there's certainly no academic estimates of this. So I'm going to use McKinsey came out last year with their best estimate of what this will cost. And this is the most detailed version of it. It'll going to cost, and this, remember, is only the production cost, and it's only if we do everything smartly, which if policy's ever been any guide, we don't. But if we do this, it'll cost us $5.6 trillion a year. That's about 5.6% of global GDP. So that's almost a third of all the stuff that we're going to be spending. Sorry, I'm not sure why I'm getting an alarm. But anyway, this is more than a third of the global tax intake of the entire world. We're talking about spending so much money that we would have to spend a third of all tax intake from every government in the world. This is just not going to happen, right? Just take a look at how much this is going to cost. So the most costly one in percent is going to be from Russia. I don't think we need to discuss whether Russia is going to be on board with climate. But even India and Sub-Saharan Africa, India is going to be spending about 9% of their GDP every year. That's 3/4 of their national tax intake, the entire Indian state's tax intake, both regional, state, and federal. They're not going to do that. We're talking about money that is just not possible to imagine. For the US, this is going to cost about 4.6%, or about $1.1 trillion this year, and it's going to get more and more costly. This is close to what the Build Back Better bill was expected to cost, which was, of course, is much, much more than what actually got passed in Congress. And this would be every year. There's just no way this is going to happen. It is, to use a fashionable word, it's unsustainable. We have not begun our journey towards net zero, and we can already see that this is going to lead to costs that are just simply not possible for most people to bear. And this is in the rich world. Remember, one study for the US shows that on average, going net zero is going to cost each American about $11,000 per person per year by 2050. Now, this is not going to bring anyone to the poorhouse because we'll be pretty rich. It'll be about, what, 11% of US income? But it is going to be a very, very large bill. And the question is, are you going to vote for the guy who says, I'm going to make you pay $11,000? Or are you going to vote for the other guy who says, I'm not? It's a very simple point. Right? This is just not going to happen. And at the same time, and I just want to emphasize this, what are the priorities for most of the rest of the world? We actually did this. So the UN did this survey back in 2015 when the world was going to set its next set of global goals. They asked people, what do you actually care about? And what the answers was, and this is not surprising, education, health, jobs, corruption, nutrition. These are things that most people care about because their kids are dying from easily curable infectious diseases. They don't have a good education. There's lots of corruption, no jobs, and little food. These are the things they care about, not the one that came at the very bottom, which was action on climate change. Again, this is not to say we're a smart civilization. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can actually do several things, and we should do things on climate change. But right now, we're not doing them in a way that is sustainable. We're not doing them in a way that will actually make it possible for the rest of the world to do this, or even for Holland and Europe and the rich world to keep doing this. So how do we do this smartly? Well, I'm going to share with you, really, this is, you may have heard of him, William Nordhaus. He's the only climate economist. He's at Yale University. He's the only climate economist to ever win the Nobel Prize in economics. And his main point, and this is really the main point from all of climate economics, is to say climate has real costs. This is the story that we always hear from climate, and that's absolutely true. But climate policy also have real costs. We need to recognize that we have to pay both. So here's what he did, and this is the best evidence that we have so far. These are all the estimates and weighted about how serious they are. If you look out here, how much temperature increase and what's the impact on global GDP in percent. So we expect most of it to be negative. That's why global warming is a real problem. These are all the best studies that are out there. I'm not saying they're true. They're simply the best studies that we have. And this is Nordhaus's estimate of how bad is global warming. This is including, that's a little disturbing. This is including all the unknown stuff. But obviously, we don't know what it is that we're not measuring. But this is the best estimate that he has. So fundamentally, if we expect a 4-degree temperature rise, this will probably cost about 4% of global GDP. It'll be worse for poor countries. It'll be better for rich countries. For instance, Denmark and Sweden, it'll probably be a net benefit, right? But for the world as a whole, this will be a negative. So how bad is this? Well, just to give you a sense of proportion, the UN actually estimate, and this is crucial, we estimate that the world will be much richer by the end of the century. If it's not, global warming will be very little of a problem because the poor part of the world will not have become rich and hence not really be emitting very much CO2. So we estimate that the average person in the world will be about 450% as rich as he or she is today. So today, it's about $18,000 per person per year, and by the end of the century, will be about $86,000 per person per year. That's a fantastic world. This is a world where we've eradicated poverty, where we've eradicated a lot of disease and all these other problems that come with it, because if you're rich, you don't get many of these problems. So that's fundamentally a great thing. But, of course, this is not the right way to look at it because we have global warming. Global warming means that we will feel less rich if we do nothing about climate change. But just to give you a sense of proportion, it's not correct to say that it's 450%, but it is correct to say that it's this slightly lower 434%. This underscores the main point that I try to say. This is a problem. It's clearly a problem that we will only be 434% as rich as we otherwise would have been in 2100. But it's not the end of the world. It's not 100% reduction, and it's certainly not a world that's not better. It's a world that's slightly less better than it otherwise could have been. That's a very different conversation. Of course, it also shows us we should stop scaring everyone with climate change and tell them this is the end of the world. No, it's a world that has a problem. So again, it's something that we should fix. How do we fix this? Well, Nordhaus estimate what are the costs of global warming. If we do nothing in his model, we'll end up with 4.1 degree centigrade. That's probably already too high, but let's just go with that because that's what his model shows. If we do nothing, the total cost of global warming is going to be about $140 trillion. This is discounted back. This is over the next 500 years. Large number, basically, is what the point is, right? If we reduce this, if we reduce the temperature, the cost will be less. This is not very surprising. This is his model only goes to 2.15 degrees. We just can't, in his model, get it further down, just simply because we still have a lot of people who want to get rich. But fundamentally, what this tells you is the standard story that you hear in every newscast around the world. Lots of warming, bad. Less warming, good. That's absolutely true if you just look at the climate damage. But there's also a climate policy cost, and that's his main contribution to this point. And again, I should just say, he's the guy who got the Nobel Prize, but a lot of similar models show very similar results. If we do nothing, what's the policy cost? Not surprisingly, it's zero. If we do something, so if we get to 3.75 degrees, the policy cost is about $20 trillion. If we try to get more, the cost goes up. The point is, we rarely, if ever, have this discussion. The more climate policy, the higher the cost. This is not surprising. This is not rocket science. Yes, there is a benefit to doing something about climate change, but there's also a cost. We need to have the conversation about both. So this is how you guys get a Nobel Prize, right? So you just simply put those two graphs together. These are all the climate costs. Then you add the policy cost up there, none, a little bit, more and more. This is fundamentally the challenge for humanity. We have only had the conversation about the black bars, but we really should have the conversation about both the black and the gray bars. His argument is this is the optimal outcome. This is going to outrage a lot of people. It certainly has outraged a lot of environmentalists because it feels like you're just trading off the world for money. But of course, this is not about money. This is about stuff that we like. This is about jobs. It's about education. It's about health. It's about opportunity. It's about all the things we like. And climate change is part of that because climate change is part of saying we would like to not have things like stronger hurricanes. We'd like to have less flooding. We'd like to have all these other things. These are also about having more opportunity for the world. And so this is, he would argue, and I think is a reasonable conversation or first starter for the discussion of saying we need to have that same conversation. And unless we have that, we might be able to get ourselves on board for a little while. We won't be able to get it to 2050 when it gets sufficiently expensive. Most even rich voters are going to turn off from this. We're never going to get China, India, and Africa on board for this. So how should we fix it? I just have like 3 minutes left, so I'm just basically going to say we have done a lot of work. So we work with more than 50 of the world's best climate economists, 3 Nobel laureates, trying to estimate what actually works and what doesn't. One of the things we do know doesn't work is the EU 2020 policy. It's been very well studied, and fundamentally what the research shows is that it's fairly costly to do climate policy in the EU. You do get some benefits because you reduce carbon emissions, and that will have long-term impacts, especially for the world's poor. If you take all of those benefits in, and all of the costs that the EU has paid, the best estimate, and again, this is a very, very wide estimate, and we can have a discussion about that afterwards, but it'll give you a good sense of it, is that for every euro we have spent, we have avoided 3 cents of climate damage. Not surprisingly, that's a really bad way to spend money because we could just have given the euro away and done 97 cents more good. If you look at the Paris Agreement, it's a little better, mostly because we managed to get a lot of poor countries on board. So both India and China have made reasonably substantial promises for 2050 and onwards, but it's still not very good. Most climate economists would argue that a smart carbon tax is a good idea. It actually turns out that it delivers $2 back in the dollar. So it has significant cost to do a climate carbon tax because it confers extra cost to the economy. It makes it less profitable, for instance, to produce a lot of energy-intensive things. But it also delivers real benefits because you actually stop using CO2, and hence you have less climate damage in the long-term future. You can reduce damages, but not very much. And with a realistic carbon tax, and certainly with an economically efficient carbon tax, you'll only reduce some, but not very much. So the question is, what is the real solution? And that's what we found. So fundamentally, what we found was this is all about innovation, which I think fits very well into the whole conversation about this, this theme. We actually found that if you do green energy innovation, for every $1 spent, you will probably avoid $11 of climate damages. That's a great investment. We should be doing that. And it fits very well with how we've learned everything in our world, right? If you think about it, we've never solved problems by telling people, I'm sorry, would you mind being a little poorer and a little less comfortable and a little colder, but at least we'll fix some of global warming? You may say yes, especially if you're going to work for a solar or some other company. But most people won't in the long run, right? We're not going to solve this problem by telling people to be worse off. The way we've solved most problems in the world is through innovation. There's a famous story. It's not entirely true, but it's a great story. I'm going to tell it anyway. So back in the 1850s, we were hunting whales to extinction. Why? Because whales have this blubber that is incredibly good to light up the world. So basically, most of Europe, most of North America seaboard was lit up with whale oil. It burnt very brightly, very cleanly. Everyone who could afford it used it. That's why we went and hunted all the whales. Now, the standard sort of climate argument would be, but the whales, please, could you go back to the slightly less comfortable, the more dirty, the less bright light, and live with that? Would that be okay for you? And most people would not say yes. It would just not happen. What did solve the problem was somebody found oil in Pennsylvania. And it turns out that it's much easier to get oil out of the ground in Pennsylvania than going out in the middle of the ocean to shoot a whale, especially because they only have a couple 100 kilos of whale blubber, right? So the fundamental point here is, if we can innovate green energy to be cheaper than fossil fuels, we've won. If we can't, we're never going to solve this problem. So I hope this conversation has been at least a starter. I get that this is not probably what you'd rather hear, but I think we'd probably be better off with knowing what's actually out there. And I look very much forward to your questions. I'll look forward to a wonderful day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bjørn. Yes, that is a bit of a uncomfortable data that we just looked at, and I'm just curious also for you, because you're on a mission. You know, you have all this data, you've done all this research, and you're obviously very passionate about what you're doing. What are some of the main critiques that you face, and how do you address them?
So one obvious critique is, if this really is the end of the world, so people will tell you, did you guys ever see the, I can't even remember what the movie was, the whole ice age that kills everyone? But you know, the whole idea of the Gulf Stream stopping, or these big catastrophes, if global warming actually led to that, then clearly we should do a lot more. And actually, there's been done a lot of studies on this. And yes, the short answer is we should do more, but surprisingly not all that much more. But you know, there's this argument, but if there's a tiny chance that this could ruin the whole world, you know, we don't have a planet B, so we should do everything we can. But of course, there's a lot of things that could damage the world. You know, I'm just going to throw North Korea out there. It seems like there's a lot of things that could go wrong in this world. Bioterrorism. There's a lot of other things that we should also be spending all of our wealth on. So this was actually a big conversation between William Nordhaus, the guy who won the Nobel Prize, and another guy whose name I forget. He was a climate economist at Harvard University. They were arguing very much. He was saying basically there's a fat tail of risks, and that means we should be spending all of our money on climate. But Nordhaus' argument, I find that convincing, is, well, there's a lot of fat tails of a lot of bad stuff that could happen in the world, and we don't spend all of our money on it. And if we were going to try to do it, we'd have to spend all of our money on all of these things, which of course is impossible. Just to give you one example of this, and I think that was his best sort of experimental data, there was, back in the 1990s, NASA made a program to map 90% of all the meteors that could be Earth killers. We know this. We know that there are meteors that are large enough out there that they could actually eradicate all life and all human life, certainly, on the planet. So that would be a real issue to look at. We should certainly be investigating that. They showed that you could do, I can't remember, it was like $8 billion. We could survey 90% of all these over the next 5 or 10 years. Then NASA also did another estimate that they could find 99% of these Earth killers at a higher price. Congress decided to say we'd like the 90%, but we don't want to pay for the 99%. And hence, the US Congress actually gave us an estimate of how much is it worth to save the world. We actually know, and this is not surprising to anyone, we're sort of willing to spend some to save the world, but not a lot. And that's how it is. And it makes sense, because global warming and meteors and everything else is not the only thing out there. There's a lot of hidden dangers, and probably most of them we don't know anything about because we haven't studied them, and nobody has, there's some point in saying, if you think about what came before global warming, it was acid rain, it was the ozone layer, there's a lot of other scares out there, and most of them are real in a sense, but only some of them make it to media attention, but there's a lot of other things we should have been worried about, clearly COVID being one of them.
Yeah, so you're also an advocate of nuance, if I can say so.
Yes.
Let's open the floor, because I'm sure there's a lot of questions out there. Who has a question? I already see a hand raised right here. And I think we have an innovative, well, it's not that innovative, actually. But we have a lovely lady with a microphone right here. Yes, right here, please. First question.
First of all, thank you so much, Bjørn. It has been an incredible talk. We've been following you and, well, your arguments for a long time with a group of friends and colleagues. So it's really an honor to hear this. I have many questions. We'll see if we can do it, but I'll actually go to one that has been striking me the most, because I see that in younger generations, in their teens, in their 20s, they have this climate fear. That's something that probably we don't experience that much, okay, in a bit older generations. But I see that their emotions play a lot, and you've already represented this, and we know that in the news, we're all being scared about this, right? And even, okay, in academia, it's also something that is popping up a lot. So my question is, okay, very technically, how much does, let's say, changing your diet, vegetarianism, can make as a change, and also, let's say, avoiding flights, how much can that change? And how can you put this as an argument for the new generations to tackle this in comparison to now turning into green energies? These are some alternatives. And how would you tackle this actually in terms of their emotions together with data? Well, you're a statistician, so yes, it's a bigger question.
Thank you very much. So fundamentally, being scared is just not a good thing, right? And you shouldn't need to say this, but there's a lot of people who are sort of like, but it makes us push for some good, right? Sure, but it's an incredibly inefficient way to push for good. Just simply having this fundamental sense of scaredness, that's just no good, because, and again, this goes to the answer to your question, most people can't do anything about this. Telling you that the world is nigh is a little bit like telling everyone, hey, you know what, you and your whole family has that gene that's going to make you have cancer real early. Well, good luck with that, right? I mean, what are you going to do with that? That's just a terrible thing to say, and it's also not true. It goes to the point that you say, which is, what can I do? Obviously, you can stop flying. Actually, that's a pretty big impact. But again, remember, most people don't fly. We're an incredibly select group of people. Probably most of you guys have flown in here. About 80% of all people in rich countries have flown at least once. The number globally is about 15%. Most people have never been on an airplane. And most people would probably like to be on one. And so again, this sense of, oh, I can give up an airplane. Well, sure you can, but that's because you fly so much. Most people would love to be able to do it. And of course, again, it goes back to that whole sort of whale bit of saying, I'm sorry, could you live without airplanes? The solution has to be that we actually make sure people have the opportunity to fly and do all these other amazing things, but without the emissions. And that's where innovation comes in. Now, I think, and again, I'm a political scientist, there's a lot of stuff I don't know, and you guys, I understand a lot of you are engineers, I think you'd know that much better, but fundamentally flying is probably the last thing we'll fix of all these things, but it's, again, it's a couple of % of emissions, so this is not what keeps me up at night. The other thing about changing your diet, I'm a vegetarian actually, not because of climate, but because I don't want to kill animals, so I decided to be a vegetarian back when I was 11. And so I'm so happy that so many more people are onto vegetarianism, because it gives me much better options. Oh, you're going to move me because you're worried about this.
Something there.
Okay, yes.
I don't want to see you have you sink through the
yes, there's a
stage.
sinkhole there. So, vegetarianism is great, but again, you're not going to get most people to do this. You can get them to do, be a little flexitarians every once in a while, and that's great. But the solution, of course, is to come up with stuff that's not meat, but tastes almost like meat. And then people are going to buy this a lot of the time. Sometimes they're not, and that's fine. We need to find innovation to make this work. But fundamentally, and I think this is a really important thing, scaring people witless, and I think a lot of people are scared witless, is just simply both bad science, but it's also bad, bad, bad for humanity. Yeah. Look, I mean, we haven't gotten here by being frightened of our own shadows. We've gotten here because we dared to do a lot of things. Now, some things were really stupid. You know, nuclear bomb springs to mind. But you know, we can't undo these things, and I don't think we can really imagine we're having that same conversation now with AI, and there's a lot of other conversations. I think we should have all of those, and yes, we're going to screw up some stuff. But you know, just trying to tell everyone, no, you can't do that, is not going to work.
Yes. And as someone working in the media, I have to completely agree that that also means bringing nuance into the stories that we're sharing in the media.
Can I, sorry, I know we should also have a question. So if you know of the last 30 years, crime in the US on all objective measures has gone down. Yeah. It's about halved. The last couple of years, because of Corona, maybe it's gone up a little bit. But fundamentally, it's dropped dramatically. Every year, when Gallup survey people in America, do you think crime is worse or better? Everyone, no, that's not true, but very, very large majorities believe crime is getting worse and worse and worse. So you have this really, really odd thing. Crime is going down, yet everybody thinks it's going up. Why? Because of more and more TV. There is so much crime that you can fill every show of every hour with crime. So just the fact that there's half as much of it simply means that there's still lots to put on TV. And that's the problem we have when you just put hurricanes after hurricane after hurricane, earthquake, whatever you put on there, and just scare people witless. Sorry.
Yeah. Good question. All right. Let's go to the lady right here on the right side.
Well, first of all, thank you for your very interesting story. And for my question, I would also like to refer to what Hannah told us in the introduction, that stories play a really big role in convincing us. And I think we as humans are not as rational beings as we would like to be. In the end, we are ruled by opportunity, emotions, and stories. And of course, you talked to us about nuance is very important. But I feel that a lot of these politicians are also using the extremes to convince us to change something. And therefore, my question is, do you think your nuanced view on this topic will ever become a big influence in our climate policies?
No. I mean, fundamentally, I'm destined to lose. You're absolutely right. There's wonderful statistics that show that if you show a picture of one boy or girl starving, that has a much, much bigger impact on people than telling there's 1 million of these guys starving, right? I mean, Stalin already said that. You kill one person, you know, it's a tragedy. You kill 1 million people, it's just a statistic, right? I'm not sure he said it, but it's a great quote anyway. But I mean, it's not that I made it up, right? But it's commonly attributed to him. So the fundamental point, and this is, so I run a think tank called the Copenhagen Consensus, where we get together lots of economists to think about what are the smartest ways to deal with the world. And we have a saying in my organization that as economists, we'd love it to be right. We'd love everybody to do smart, but we always tell ourselves, this is not about getting it right. It's about getting it slightly less wrong, right? So my goal is simply in this world to get it slightly less wrong. If I can manage to get people to be slightly less, pick slightly less dumb policies, I'm satisfied.
The mission to get it slightly less wrong, I like that. Okay, let's see, who has a really critical question? Yes? All right. Right there, the guy with the blonde hair, yes.
Hi, I'm Tom, and I think you tell really great stories through data, but I'm not really, I don't really agree with it. You talk a lot about direct climate damages, like hurricanes, and that adaptation is the way to solve it all. But I think adaptation also has really big downsides. The biggest one that comes up to me is climate migration, and the societal strain that puts it on, for example, Europe. How do you look on that, and will that also, because I don't think that adaptation will solve it all and be a really happy ending, so let's build some dikes like we did in Holland and it's all fine. If we get loads and loads of people migrating, that also will be a very big problem.
That's a great question, and it's a good point. It's very, very hard. So there's no good data on migration issues. So you're absolutely right. If a lot of people decide, for instance, if Africa becomes too hot or flooded or whatever, they decide to all migrate to Europe, that's going to be a huge cost. And so very clearly, that's a negative downside. I'm not saying that, by the way, we should adapt to everything. I'm saying we will end up adapting to a very large part of this. And so the actual damages are going to be much less than what you would expect, sort of a naive thing of just saying, well, if it floods, everybody will have to move. That was the main point of it, that it's much less. But it's not that it's going to be nothing, and so we should fix it. But it means we can fix it smarter, and we can also take longer time to fix it. On the migration bit, the simple point, and the EU talks about it, but not really. The simple point, of course, is Africa should be rich. If Africa was rich, people wouldn't want to move, right? And we're, in some sense, telling, I know that you have, and I have the advantage of having Mike, sorry, but fundamentally, we know how to get most people rich. And a very large part of it is about having lots and lots of energy. But we're telling, you know what, we'd like to have all our fossil fuels. And look what happened with the Russian invasion. It was not like Germany said, yeah, okay, we're just going to freeze a little more. No, they just start building a lot more gas. Instead, what we're telling all of the Africans is, you can't build new fossil fuel plants. But of course, that is what they need in order to get rich. They certainly also need solar, they also need wind, but it's not in nearly that proportion that it'll mean that they will not need much, much more energy. One of my favorite statistics, I did this for Wall Street Journal, was that the whole nation of Uganda, which is 44 million people, bigger than California, has as much electricity as California uses for heating its bathtubs. There's something wrong in that world, right? And again, it's not to say that this is also something we should fix. So the other part of the conversation, and I'm sure we could have a long, I should just say, I'll hang around here afterwards because I recognize that there's way too many questions. So let's have a talk about this afterwards. But fundamentally, sure, we should also fix this by doing climate policy. But my argument is that right now, we're just doing it incredibly ineffectively. We're mostly doing it in rich countries. And so we'll actually not help Africa very much. We'll help it a tiny bit. What we should do was help Africa a lot with the things that they actually care about right now and make sure that we fix climate change, but only over a century-long time frame.
Does that answer your question? Okay, you're going to find Bjørn afterwards. Okay, great.
He's going to find you.
He's going to find you. Okay, there's been some questions. Let's find someone there on the left. Maybe the lady in blue. Oh, yes, both of you? You have a mutual...
Yeah. I think you've said some quite controversial things, and for me, to be honest, it's not really in line with my own opinion about climate change, and also not really what I think I read when reading the latest IPCC report. And of course, I've Googled you before this event. We've been criticized a lot for misusing statistics in some sense, so I was wondering what your answer to those critics is.
Well, yes, there's certainly been a lot of critics. I have made extensive answers to a lot of those people. So there's been a whole book devoted to me. There's been a lot of people who've made criticisms. I find, and this is not surprising, it's very, very hard to ask me, do I think they're smart and they're really good and they have integrity and I'm an idiot? You can't be surprised that I'm going to say no, but they aren't. Fundamentally, so there's very clearly a lot of emotion involved in this. There's a lot of sort of political influence and a lot of intense sort of power over the whole what do you call it, the agenda setting opportunity. So for instance, in 2015 for the Paris Agreement, I did what I think is a very, very uncontroversial model estimate. I just simply ran the UN climate model with what would happen if everybody did the Paris Agreement and what happened if they didn't do the Paris Agreement. And not surprisingly, to 2030, which was what back then we were talking about we were going to promise, the difference was virtually zero. You would barely be able to tell the difference by the end of the century. This is no different from Kyoto and everything else before, and I was basically using the same template that another very, very well-respected climate modeler, Wigley, had done for the Kyoto Protocol. This became intensely under scrutiny. So the journal who published it, they got inundated by people who said you can't publish it. One of the guys who sat on the board was Nicholas Stern, the guy who did the Stern report in the UK. He threatened to resign unless one of his guys got to write a piece right after mine saying that this was hokum. I think it's a terrible piece that he wrote. It was basically a hit job and there was no truth to it. It was a setup, but, and this is what tells you, I was not allowed a response. I said, well, at least if you're going to skirt all journal setups and just simply put in this after my article, basically here's Bjørn's article saying that it'll only be a very small impact, and here's a guy who says Bjørn is an idiot, but no, you can't say anything to that. That doesn't seem like a strong argument, and I did put out obviously online why this was not correct, and I still think that holds. I still think my argument is absolutely correct, but it was incredibly inconvenient, and I think that's the main reason why this is happening. Now, am I cherry picking? I really don't think I am. I actually think I'm using the right statistics, because very often I insist on saying we need to bring in the social impact on this. You can't just say, what will a meter sea level rise mean without also talking about what will the impact of that be on human societies. But some people will say, oh, but that diminishes the impact of climate because you're looking at the social impact. And I'm like, yes, that's exactly the point. That's the point I make. That's what a social scientist would say. You can't say, and this is what much of climate conversation is about, assume that climate changes, but nothing else does. I get why you do that if you're a climate scientist and you want to make an interesting comparison. That makes sense, but it's not a good way to inform our politicians. So I would argue that a very, very large part of the sort of criticism against me, again, you can't be surprised you're getting this answer, but I really honestly believe that it's untrue, and it comes from a place of mostly people who are very, very good-hearted and want to do good, but have also been caught up in this very, very narrow part of the conversation.
Good, yes, we need to round up because of time. I'm going to do one last short question on the right. Lady in red, Mr. in red, sorry. I'm thinking about that song, that's probably it.
I would like to go back to the first statement you made today about how climate change is not the big emergency it is as we are told. And I feel like all your counter arguments are kind of based on like human-based or economy-based. And it kind of misses the whole point of nature-based impacts, such as biodiversity loss, bleaching of corals, as we're currently experiencing, drought in rainforests. What's your view on that?
Yes, this is a very important point, and you're absolutely right. I almost exclusively focused my talk on humans. And fundamentally, the point is, this is not going to be a meteor for humans. So you're right. But what about everything else on the planet? We share this with a lot of other stuff. Well, it's more varied, and if you look at most of these estimates of what actually impacts biodiversity, even the World Wildlife Fund and many other organizations will tell you that climate comes far down the list of what influences biodiversity. It's mostly about deforestation. It's about human use of resources that we're encroaching on natural resources, that we have more transport around the world, so we have more invasive species. It's all of those things, and those are things that when you're rich, you're much better able to deal with. So, fundamentally, and again, I'm making a very, very sort of short-cut version of this. If you're poor, you have poachers in your natural parks. But if you're rich, you have lots of elephants, right? So the whole point, in a sense, is to make sure that people get more resilient. That is, they get better off. They stop being as poor. then they can also afford to deal a lot more with their natural issues. The other part I just want to leave you with, and I think this is a vastly underestimated point, according to a recent Nature article, there are 3 main indicators of climate change. 2 of them you've heard. That's sea level rise and temperature. The third one is that the world is getting much, much greener because of global warming, right? Because of CO2. CO2 is a fertilizer, and we know from satellites, certainly over the last 30 years, that we have about, 15–20% more green stuff on the planet. We're very likely by the end of the century to have much, much more green stuff. Now, remember, we've cut down a lot of green stuff, especially in Europe, so it's not like we'll probably be back towards 1500 by the end of this century, but there'll be a lot more green stuff. By sort of any estimate, I would say that that's a good thing. Again, I'm not making the argument that this is all good. That would be a silly argument. Just like the people I'm countering are making climate is only bad. I'm not saying it's only good. I'm just saying they're both goods and bads. Overall, there are more bads than goods, so that's why it's a problem. But actually, we have biodiversity problems. We'll fix them mostly by getting people out of poverty. And we have a situation where we'll have more biomass on the planet than ever before, than we've had over the last 100, 150 years because of more CO2. So that's not a totally bad outcome. Sorry, I know I have to shut up.
Thank you thank you so much for all of your questions. I'm very happy that you're going to remain here a little bit longer, so please do walk up to Dr. Bjørn Lomborg and ask your questions, because this is a very uncomfortable but a very important discussion. Quick, one line. You want to make, your mission is about getting it slightly less wrong. One of the big solutions is innovation. There's a lot of people here that are really, really good in innovation. What's your advice to them when it comes to dare to lead?
So again, oh God.
One line, short.
You made the point that we don't have simple answers, and that's, unfortunately, this is not, I wish all of you to come up with these great ideas, but this is really a long, long race. You're not going to come up with it today. You're certainly not today, but you're not going to come up with it the next 5 or 10 years. This is really a century-long race, and we're much better able and much better placed if we can actually allow ourselves to see that. But it'd be so much more fun if it's just one person that needs to come up with a great idea, and then we're all done. Sorry, that's a real downer. Hey, have a fun day.
All right, let's continue discussions.
Yeah.
Give him a big round of applause, Dr. Bjørn Lomborg. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.